The phone rang at 2 in the morning, and Ethan Reyes knew before he even opened his eyes that something was wrong. Nobody called a repair shop at that hour unless they were desperate. He sat up fast, his heart already pounding, and grabbed the phone from the nightstand before it could ring a second time and wake Lily in the next room. "Reyes Auto Repair," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Please," a woman's voice answered, shaking and breathless. "Please, I need help. My car just stopped in the middle of nowhere, and I don't know what to do." Ethan rubbed his eyes and looked at the storm hammering against his window. Rain was falling so hard it sounded like gravel hitting the glass. Thunder rolled somewhere close, and the whole house seemed to shiver with it. "Ma'am, where are you exactly?" he asked, already reaching for his boots. "I don't know the name of the road. There's a sign back there, something with the number 9 on it. I'm scared. It's completely dark out here, and my phone battery is almost gone." Something about the fear in her voice made Ethan move faster than he wanted to admit. He was a father first and a mechanic second, and leaving Lily alone at night was something he never did lightly. But she was 8 now, old enough to understand when he explained things simply, and the Petersons next door had given him a spare key years ago for exactly this kind of emergency. He pulled on a jacket, checked on Lily one more time. She was curled up under her blanket, breathing slow and steady, and left a note on the kitchen counter in case she woke up. Then he called Mrs. Peterson, who groaned but agreed to come sit in the living room until he got back. The storm outside was worse than he expected. His truck fought the wind the entire drive, wipers slapping uselessly against sheets of rain. Highway 9 was a stretch he avoided most nights because the streetlights had been broken for months, and the county never seemed to get around to fixing them. Driving it in weather like this felt like driving through a wall of water with no bottom. It took him almost 25 minutes to find her. The headlights of her stalled SUV blinked weakly through the downpour, hazard lights struggling to stay lit. He pulled up behind the vehicle and stepped out into the storm, soaked within seconds. The woman who climbed out to meet him looked nothing like what he expected from a call this frightened. She wore simple clothes, a plain gray coat and jeans, nothing that hinted at money or status. Her dark hair was plastered to her face from the rain, and there was real fear in her eyes, the kind that couldn't be faked. "Thank you for coming," she said, practically shouting over the wind. "I didn't know who else to call. I found your number on a sign a few miles back." "You're lucky that sign was still standing in this weather," Ethan said, trying to sound calmer than he felt. "Let's get you out of the rain. Pop the hood for me." She did, and Ethan went to work immediately, flashlight clenched between his teeth, hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 15 years fixing engines. The rain made everything harder. His fingers were numb within minutes, but he kept working, checking the battery connections, the fuel line, the belts, anything that could explain why a car this expensive had simply died on an empty road. "You didn't have to come out in this," the woman said, standing close enough to hold the flashlight steady for him. "I would have understood if you said no. Somebody's stranded and scared. I'm not going to say no," Ethan answered simply, not looking up from the engine. She went quiet after that, watching him work with an expression he couldn't quite read. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something closer to surprise, like she wasn't used to people helping her without wanting something in return. After nearly 40 minutes in the storm, Ethan found the problem, a corroded connector that had finally given out after months of slow damage, probably worsened by the flooding on the road. He didn't have the exact part in his truck, but he had something close enough to get her moving again safely, at least until she could reach a proper shop in daylight. When the engine finally turned over and roared back to life, the woman let out a breath of pure relief. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, already reaching into her coat for her wallet. "Please, let me pay you. Whatever you think is fair, I'll double it." Ethan shook his head and closed the hood. "Just get home safe. That's payment enough." "You don't understand," she pressed, stepping closer, rain still falling around them. "You drove out here in a storm in the middle of the night for a stranger. That's not something people do for free." "Where I'm from, it is," he said with a tired smile. "Drive careful. That road floods near the bridge." He was already walking back to his truck when she called after him, asking for his name, but the wind swallowed most of it, and by the time she caught up enough to hear his reply, he had already climbed inside and was pulling away, leaving her standing there in the rain, staring after him like she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The drive home felt shorter than the drive out, maybe because the adrenaline of the storm was fading, Or maybe because his mind kept circling back to the stranger's face and the strange, quiet way she had watched him work, as if kindness itself was something rare and unfamiliar to her. Mrs. Peterson was asleep on the couch when he got home, and Lily hadn't stirred at all. He thanked his neighbor quietly, walked her back to her house through the last of the rain, and finally allowed himself to breathe. It was nearly 4 in the morning by the time he sat down at the kitchen table, exhausted, still damp, staring at the envelope that had been sitting there since yesterday afternoon. He hadn't opened it yet. He already knew what it said. Final notice. 90 days past due. If payment is not received in full within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings will begin. Ethan pressed his palms against his eyes and sat there in the silence of his kitchen, listening to the storm finally begin to fade outside. The shop had been his father's before it was his, a small brick building on the corner of 5th and Miller that had survived 3 recessions, a fire, and more hard years than he could count. It had survived everything, except the last 3 years, the years since his wife passed away, and left him alone to raise Lily, while trying to keep the business afloat on his own. He had cut every corner he could. He worked longer hours, took on jobs he used to send to other shops, skipped his own paycheck more times than he wanted to admit. None of it had been enough. The loan he'd taken out to cover Lily's medical bills after the accident that took her mother had turned into a weight he couldn't lift no matter how hard he tried. 30 days. That was all he had left before the shop his father built with his own hands would belong to a bank that had never turned a wrench in its life. Ethan folded the letter, tucked it back into the drawer where he kept the rest of the unopened mail he wasn't ready to face, and finally allowed himself to think about something else. The strange woman on Highway 9, soaked and frightened, watching him with an expression he still couldn't place. He told himself he would probably never see her again. People like her, whoever she was, didn't stay in towns like this. She would drive back to wherever she came from, tell the story of the stranger who fixed her car in a storm, and forget about it within a week. He had no way of knowing that by helping a stranger on a flooded highway in the middle of the night, he had just changed the direction of his entire life, and hers as well. He only knew that Lily would be waking up in a few hours, that the shop needed to open by 8, and that somehow, some way, he had 30 days to find a miracle. He climbed the stairs quietly, checked on his daughter one last time, and lay down for what little was left of the night, unaware that across town, in a hotel suite far nicer than anything in this part of the state, the woman he had helped was still awake, staring out at the storm, already asking her assistant to find out everything he could about the man who fixed cars for strangers and refused to take a single dollar for it. The elevator doors opened onto the 40th floor, and Victoria Sterling stepped out into a hallway of glass and steel that had once made her feel powerful, and now, more and more often, made her feel completely alone. It was 8 in the morning, and she had already been awake for 6 hours, most of them spent staring at a laptop screen filled with numbers that could end everything she had spent 20 years building. "They're already in the conference room," her assistant Nora said, falling into step beside her, tablet clutched to her chest like a shield. "All 3 of them. They arrived early on purpose." "Of course they did," Victoria said, not slowing her pace. "Men like that always think arriving early makes them look serious." The 3 men waiting in the glass conference room represented the largest shareholders outside of Victoria's own family trust, and all 3 had made it clear over the past month that they no longer trusted her judgment. The company her father built, the one she had run for the past 9 years without a single major failure, was suddenly one bad quarter away from a hostile takeover, and the reason had nothing to do with numbers. It had to do with her son. Oliver was 12 years old, and 3 months ago doctors had found something on a routine scan that nobody wanted to say out loud until they were certain. The uncertainty had stretched for weeks, then months, pulling Victoria into hospital hallways and specialist offices at every hour of the day and night. She had missed board meetings. She had delegated decisions she used to make herself, and somewhere in that stretch of fear and exhaustion, a group of investors led by a man named Gerald Kane had decided her distraction was an opportunity. "Victoria," Gerald said as she entered the room, his smile as practiced as everything else about him. "So glad you could join us. We were beginning to wonder." "I had a call that ran long," she said, taking her seat at the head of the table without offering an apology. "Let's not waste time pretending this is a friendly visit, Gerald. Say what you came to say." Gerald folded his hands on the table, clearly enjoying the moment more than he should have. The board is concerned. 3 missed meetings in 2 months. Delegated authority on major decisions. A noticeable absence during the merger negotiations last quarter. Some of us are starting to wonder if you're still the right person to lead this company. My son has been sick, Victoria said flatly, refusing to let her voice shake, even though the words cost her something every time she said them out loud. I don't apologize for prioritizing that. Nobody is asking you to apologize, said the second investor, a quieter man named Desmond Cole, though his tone suggested otherwise. We're simply asking whether leadership and personal crisis can coexist without damaging shareholder value. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, circling the same points from different angles, each man taking his turn to suggest, without quite saying it directly, that Victoria step back and let someone more available take control. She fought through every argument with the same sharp precision that had gotten her this far, but she could feel the room shifting against her, inch by inch, the way a tide pulls sand out from under your feet without you noticing, until you're already unsteady. By the time the meeting ended, nothing had been decided, but nothing had been resolved either. A formal vote was scheduled for the following month, and everyone in that room understood exactly what that vote could mean. Victoria didn't go back to her office right away. Instead, she found herself standing at the window overlooking the city, thinking not about the board, not about Gerald Kane's calculated smile, but about a stranger on a dark highway 3 nights earlier, who had driven out into a storm for no reason except that someone needed help. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about him since. It wasn't romantic, not yet, not in any way she could name clearly. It was something simpler and stranger than that. In a world where every kindness came with a price tag, every favor came with an expectation, she had met a man who fixed her car in the middle of a storm and refused to take a single dollar for it. He hadn't known who she was. He hadn't asked. He had simply helped because someone needed help, and then he had driven away without waiting to be thanked properly. She had asked Nora to find out his name the same night, more out of curiosity than anything else, expecting it to lead nowhere. Instead, it had led somewhere she didn't expect at all. His name is Ethan Reyes, Nora told her later that afternoon, setting a folder on Victoria's desk. He owns a small repair shop in Millhaven, about 40 minutes outside the city, runs it alone since his father passed. There's a daughter too, 8 years old. His wife died 3 years ago in a car accident. Victoria opened the folder slowly, scanning the details, and stopped when she reached the last page, a copy of a foreclosure notice, dated 2 days before she had broken down on Highway 9, sat clipped to a summary of outstanding debt that made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't expected. The man who had refused her money in the middle of a storm was 30 days away from losing everything his father had built. "Cancel my afternoon," Victoria said quietly, still staring at the paper. "Ma'am? I want to see the shop." Nora hesitated, glancing at the folder, clearly sensing there was more happening here than simple curiosity. Is that wise, given everything with the board right now? If anyone connects this to you, especially with the timing. I'm not asking for a strategy meeting, Nora. I'm asking you to clear my afternoon. 3 hours later, Victoria stood across the street from Reyes Auto Repair, watching through the window as Ethan worked underneath a car, sleeves rolled up, grease on his forearms, completely unaware that anyone was watching him at all. A small girl with dark curly hair sat on a stool near the front counter, doing homework at a folding table, occasionally looking up to ask her father a question that made him laugh, even in the middle of his work. Victoria stood there longer than she meant to, something loosening in her chest that had been tight for months. There was a kind of peace in that shop that she hadn't felt in her own life in years, despite everything she had, despite every meeting room and glass tower and number on a screen that supposedly measured success. She almost turned around and left without going inside. It would have been easier, safer certainly, given everything Gerald Kane and the board were watching for. But she thought about the storm, about a man who helped a stranger without asking for anything, and she found herself crossing the street before she had fully decided to. The bell above the door rang as she stepped inside, and Ethan slid out from under the car, wiping his hands on a rag, confusion crossing his face, as recognition slowly followed. "You," he said, straightening up. "The storm. Highway 9. "Victoria," she said, offering her hand. "I never got the chance to properly introduce myself, or thank you the way I should have." "You don't owe me anything," Ethan said, though he shook her hand anyway, his grip firm and warm, despite the grease still on his palm. "Glad you made it home safe." The little girl at the folding table looked up with open curiosity, studying Victoria the way children study anything unfamiliar, without pretense. "This is my daughter, Lily," Ethan said, following her gaze. "Lily, this is the lady I helped a few nights ago." "You're the one from the storm," Lily said, brightening immediately. "Dad talked about you at breakfast. He said you were really scared, but you didn't cry, which he said was pretty brave." Victoria felt something catch in her throat, unexpected and unfamiliar. "Your dad was very kind to me. I wanted to come thank him properly." "He's like that with everybody," Lily said matter-of-factly, returning to her homework, as if the conversation had reached its natural end. "Mrs. Delgado down the street says he's the nicest man in Millhaven." Ethan looked slightly embarrassed but didn't correct his daughter. Instead, he gestured toward the small waiting area near the front of the shop. "Can I get you anything? Coffee's not great, but it's hot." "I'm fine," Victoria said, glancing around the shop, taking in the worn but carefully organized tools, the faded photograph on the wall of an older man standing proudly in front of the same building decades earlier, clearly Ethan's father. "I actually came because I wanted to ask you something, if you don't mind." "Go ahead. Would you let me pay you properly for what you did, not as charity, as a fair transaction for services rendered, the way you would charge anyone else who needed emergency roadside help?" Ethan's expression shifted, something guarded settling over his face. "I already told you. That's not necessary. I understand you don't need the money," Victoria said carefully, though she suspected the opposite was true. "But I would feel better knowing I hadn't taken advantage of your kindness." "You didn't take advantage of anything," Ethan said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I don't want your money, Victoria. I helped you because it was the right thing to do, not because I was looking for a payday." She studied him for a long moment, and something about his stubborn refusal, the quiet dignity in the way he said it, made her respect him even more than she already did. Most people in her life would have taken the money without hesitation. Most people in her life measured everything by what it could get them. "Then let me at least buy your daughter something from the bakery down the street," Victoria said, offering a small smile. "I passed it walking over here. It smelled incredible." Lily's head shot up immediately. "They have cinnamon rolls the size of your face." Ethan laughed, the sound easy and warm, and for a moment the tension in the shop dissolved completely. All right. Cinnamon rolls, but that's it. No more arguing about payment." "Deal," Victoria said, and for the first time in months, she meant something without calculating what it might cost her. She stayed longer than she planned, sitting on an old stool near the counter while Ethan finished the car he was working on, listening to Lily talk about school and her favorite books, and a science project involving volcanoes that had apparently gone slightly wrong the week before. It was such a simple afternoon, filled with nothing that mattered in the world Victoria usually lived in, and yet she couldn't remember the last time she had felt this settled. She didn't tell them who she was, not the company, not the board, not the vote hanging over her future like a blade waiting to fall. She told herself it was because it wasn't relevant, that Ethan didn't need to know, but some part of her recognized the real reason. For the first time in years, she was being seen as simply a person, not a name attached to a fortune, and she wasn't ready to give that up yet. It was nearly evening by the time she left, promising Lily she would visit again soon, ignoring the persistent buzzing of her phone in her purse that had been going off for the better part of an hour. She didn't check it until she was back in the car, and when she finally did, her stomach dropped. 6 missed calls from Nora, 1 text message that made her blood run cold. "Gerald knows about the mechanic. He's asking questions about why you were in Millhaven this afternoon. This could be bad, Victoria. We need to talk immediately." Victoria sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, staring at the message, thinking about the shop across the street, about Ethan's stubborn refusal to accept help he desperately needed, about a foreclosure notice sitting in a folder on her desk with 30 days on the clock. She had wanted, just for one afternoon, to be someone who helped without complications, without strategy, without the world watching and calculating what every move might mean. That afternoon, it seemed, was already over. The bank called at 9 in the morning, exactly when Ethan was elbow-deep in a transmission that refused to cooperate. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something told him to answer, and he was glad he did, though not for the reason he expected. Mr. Reyes, I'm calling to confirm receipt of the full payment on your outstanding loan balance, the woman on the other end said, her voice pleasant and completely unaware of the confusion crashing through him. The account has been closed as of this morning. No further action is needed on your part. Ethan set down his wrench slowly, grease-stained fingers suddenly still. I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I haven't made any payment. There must be some mistake. There's no mistake, sir. The full balance was paid yesterday afternoon by wire transfer. Your foreclosure proceedings have been canceled and your account shows a zero balance. He asked her 3 more times to confirm, before he finally accepted what she was telling him, and even then, disbelief sat heavy in his chest as he hung up the phone. Someone had paid off his entire debt, the debt that had been suffocating him for 3 years, the debt he thought would cost him his father's shop within the month. He knew immediately who it was. There was only one person who had visited the shop recently, only one person who had asked, almost too casually, about paying him properly for something he had refused payment for already. Ethan drove to the address Nora had given him 2 days earlier without calling first, without thinking through what he would say, driven entirely by a mixture of gratitude and something sharper that he couldn't quite name yet. The building rose up in front of him, 40 stories of glass reflecting the afternoon sun, nothing like anything in Millhaven, and for the first time he understood, really understood, exactly who Victoria Sterling was. Sterling Industries. He had seen the name on business news he never paid attention to. On headlines he had scrolled past 100 times without connecting them to the woman who had sat on a stool in his shop, eating cinnamon rolls with his daughter. The receptionist tried to stop him, insisting he needed an appointment, but Ethan wasn't in the mood to wait, and something in his expression must have convinced the security guard nearby not to intervene right away. By the time Victoria's assistant Nora came rushing out to intercept him, he was already standing in front of Victoria's office door. Mr. Reyes, please, if you could just wait a moment. It's fine, Nora, Victoria said, standing up from her desk as Ethan walked in, her expression shifting from surprise to something more careful. Ethan, I didn't expect you. You paid off my loan, he said, not bothering with pleasantries, the entire thing, without asking me. I did, she admitted, no hesitation in her voice, though her eyes searched his face carefully, trying to read where this conversation was going. Why would you do that? Ethan asked, his voice tighter than he intended. I told you I didn't want your money. I told you that twice. You told me you didn't want payment for helping me on the highway, Victoria corrected gently. This wasn't payment. I saw the notice in your shop, the foreclosure warning, and I couldn't just ignore it knowing I could help. That's not your decision to make, Ethan said, his jaw tight. That shop is the only thing I have left of my father. It's not some charity project for you to fix because you felt guilty, or because you have money sitting around and nothing better to do with it. Victoria's expression hardened slightly, stung by the accusation. That's not what this was. Isn't it? Ethan pushed, the frustration he had been holding back finally breaking loose. You come into my shop, you don't tell me who you are, you let my daughter get attached to you, and then behind my back you write a check to solve a problem I never asked you to solve. Do you know what that feels like? Do you have any idea? I was trying to help someone who helped me first, Victoria said, her own voice rising now, the composure she wore like armor in every boardroom starting to crack. Forgive me for thinking that mattered more than your pride. It's not pride, Ethan snapped. It's respect. There's a difference between helping someone and deciding for them what they need, without even asking. I've spent 3 years fighting to keep that shop standing on my own, and in one afternoon you erased all of that like it meant nothing. The room went silent except for the faint hum of the building around them, both of them breathing hard, years of separate struggles suddenly colliding in a way neither had expected. I'm sorry, Victoria finally said, quieter now. You're right. I should have asked you first. I got so used to solving problems with money that I forgot some things aren't mine to solve. Ethan's anger deflated slightly at the honesty in her voice, though the tension between them remained. I appreciate what you tried to do. I do. But I need you to reverse it. I'll find another way. I can't reverse it, Victoria said. The loan is closed, but I can promise you this. I won't make another decision like that without talking to you first. Before Ethan could respond, the office door opened without a knock, and Gerald Kane stepped inside with 2 other men trailing behind him, his expression carrying the satisfied edge of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Well, Gerald said, glancing between Victoria and Ethan with obvious interest, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Gerald, this is a private conversation, Victoria said, her voice snapping back into its boardroom sharpness instantly. Is it? Gerald asked, stepping further into the room, eyes lingering on Ethan with open curiosity. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the CEO of this company is having a very personal conversation with a small-town mechanic she paid off yesterday, using discretionary funds that, technically, require board approval for transactions of that size. Ethan felt the weight of the accusation settle over the room, watching Victoria's face carefully as she processed exactly what Gerald was implying. That transaction was well within my authority, Victoria said evenly. Perhaps, Gerald said, though his tone made it clear he didn't believe that for a second. Or perhaps this is exactly the kind of distraction the board has been concerned about. A CEO neglecting company priorities to chase after a man she met on the side of a highway. Rather convenient timing, don't you think? Right before an important vote. That's enough, Gerald, Victoria said, her voice low and dangerous. I'll leave you two alone, Gerald said, offering a thin smile as he turned toward the door, his companions following behind him. But I imagine this story will be very interesting to certain members of the press, should it happen to reach them. The door closed behind them, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before it. He's going to try to use this against you, Ethan said slowly, understanding dawning on him. Against the company, against your position. Yes, Victoria said simply, sitting back down in her chair, suddenly looking exhausted in a way she hadn't allowed herself to appear moments earlier. There's a vote in a few weeks. Some board members think I've been too distracted lately to lead effectively. My son has been sick, and I've missed things I normally wouldn't miss, and Gerald has been circling like a shark waiting for an opening. Ethan felt something shift inside him, the anger from moments ago giving way to something more complicated. You have a son? Oliver. He's 12. He's been going through some difficult medical tests these past few months. Victoria rubbed her temple, the weight of everything finally showing through the cracks in her composure. I haven't told many people that. It's not something I discuss easily. Understanding passed between them, quiet and unspoken. Two parents, both carrying burdens they rarely let anyone see, both fighting battles that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the people they loved most. I'm sorry, Ethan said, and this time he meant it differently than before. About your son, about all of this. I'm the one who should apologize, Victoria said. I made a mistake, coming to your shop, letting Lily get close to me, without thinking about what it could mean if this got complicated. I should have been more careful. Don't say that, Ethan said quickly, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Lily hasn't stopped talking about you since you left. She doesn't need careful. She needs people who show up. Victoria looked up at him, something vulnerable crossing her expression that he hadn't seen in the shop, hadn't seen anywhere in this glass building full of careful, guarded faces. What if showing up costs you everything, Ethan? What if the people who are supposed to trust you decide you're not who they thought you were? He didn't have an answer for that, not one that felt big enough for the question, so instead he sat down across from her, the anger from earlier replaced by something steadier. Then we figure it out, together, if you'll let me help. Outside the glass walls of the office, the city continued its ordinary rhythm, cars moving through streets, people hurrying to meetings that felt urgent and important, none of them aware that in a quiet office on the 40th floor, a mechanic from a small town and a woman who ran an empire were quietly deciding not to let fear win, even as a storm far more dangerous than the one on Highway 9 was already gathering on the horizon, waiting to test exactly how strong that decision really was. The first van showed up outside the shop at 7 in the morning, before Ethan had even opened the front door. By 8, there were 3 more. Cameras mounted on shoulders, reporters checking their microphones, all of them crowded onto the sidewalk of a street that had never seen this much attention in its entire history. Mr. Reyes, is it true you've been in a secret relationship with Victoria Sterling? Did she pay off your debts in exchange for something? Can you comment on the nature of your relationship? Is your daughter aware of the situation? How does she feel about her father's connection to a billionaire? Ethan stood frozen just inside the shop door, watching through the glass as the questions piled on top of each other, feeling something cold settle in his stomach as he realized exactly what had happened. Gerald Kane hadn't just threatened to go to the press. He had actually done it, and whatever story he had fed them had twisted every piece of truth into something ugly and cheap. Lily's school bus wasn't due for another hour, which meant she was still upstairs in the apartment above the shop, and Ethan's first thought, his only thought, was keeping her away from the chaos outside. He called Mrs. Peterson immediately, asking her to come get Lily through the back entrance and keep her at her house for the day. No explanations, just urgency in his voice that made his neighbor agree without asking a single question. By the time Lily was safely out the back door, holding her backpack and looking confused about the change in routine, the crowd outside had doubled in size. His phone rang constantly, numbers he didn't recognize, reporters who had somehow gotten his personal cell number, and buried among all of them, one message from Victoria that made his hands shake as he read it. "I'm so sorry. I'm coming to Millhaven right now. Please don't say anything to them until I get there." Ethan locked the front door, flipped the sign to closed for the first time in longer than he could remember, and sat in the back office trying to steady his breathing, trying not to think about what this would mean for Lily, for the shop, for the quiet, ordinary life he had spent years rebuilding after losing his wife. 40 minutes later, a car pulled up that cut straight through the crowd of reporters, and Victoria stepped out into the chaos without a moment of hesitation, cameras flashing around her from every direction. Ethan watched through the window, torn between wanting to keep her out of this mess and needing, more than he expected, to see her walk through that door. She came inside, and the moment the door closed behind her, muffling the shouted questions outside, she reached for his hands, without saying anything at first, just holding them, steadying him. "This is my fault," she said quietly. "Gerald leaked a story to a tabloid, twisted everything about the loan payment into something it wasn't. I'm so sorry, Ethan. I never wanted this to touch you or Lily." "Where is she?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. "Is Lily safe?" "At Mrs. Peterson's. She doesn't know what's happening. I made sure of that before I locked the door." Victoria nodded, relief crossing her face briefly, before the weight of everything else settled back over her. "I have to go out there. I have to tell them the truth before this spirals any further out of control." "They'll twist whatever you say," Ethan warned. "That's what people like Gerald count on." "Maybe," Victoria said, straightening her shoulders, something resolute settling into her expression that reminded Ethan of the woman who ran a company with thousands of employees, not the woman who had sat nervously on a stool eating cinnamon rolls weeks earlier. "But I'm done letting other people control my story. I should have done this from the start." She walked back outside, and Ethan followed close behind her, standing just off to the side as she faced the wall of cameras and shouted questions with a calm that seemed to quiet the chaos almost immediately. "I want to say something and then I'll answer questions," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly over the crowd. "Weeks ago, my car broke down during a storm on a remote highway. I was frightened and alone, and a stranger drove out in the middle of the night to help me, expecting nothing in return. That stranger is Ethan Reyes, a mechanic and a single father who has spent years working himself to exhaustion to keep his family's business alive and provide for his daughter." The reporters quieted slightly, cameras still rolling, capturing every word. "I later learned his shop was facing foreclosure, and I made a decision to help pay off that debt, the same way he helped me without asking for anything. That decision was mine alone, made out of gratitude, not manipulation, not romance, not any of the ugly narratives being circulated this morning. Ethan Reyes is a good man who has been dragged into a situation he never asked for, simply because he showed kindness to a stranger on a dark road." A reporter near the front raised her hand. "Ms. Sterling, some sources are suggesting this payment violated company policy regarding discretionary spending. Can you address that?" "The payment came entirely from my personal funds, not company resources," Victoria said firmly. "Anyone suggesting otherwise is spreading false information, likely for reasons that have far more to do with an upcoming board vote than with any genuine concern for company policy." The implication landed clearly, and several reporters exchanged glances, already sensing there was a bigger story here than the one Gerald had tried to sell them. Victoria answered a few more questions, calm and direct, refusing to let the narrative slip back into speculation, and slowly, gradually, the energy of the crowd shifted from hostile curiosity to something closer to sympathy. By the time she finished, several reporters were already typing notes that looked less like scandal headlines and more like a story about a billionaire businesswoman who had quietly helped a struggling small-town family without expecting anything in return. It took another hour for the crowd to fully disperse, but by early afternoon, the The street outside the shop was quiet again, though the tension inside Ethan's chest hadn't fully released. "That took courage," he said, once they were finally alone inside the shop, the closed sign still hanging on the door. "It was long overdue," Victoria said, sitting down heavily on the same stool Lily usually used for her homework. "I've spent so many years letting other people control the story around me, protecting myself by staying guarded, and it never actually protected me from anything. It just made me lonely." Ethan sat down across from her, studying her face carefully. "What happens now? With the board? With Gerald?" "The vote is still coming," Victoria admitted, "but Gerald just showed the entire board exactly the kind of man he is, using a personal tragedy and a private kindness as a weapon for his own gain. That might work in my favor more than he expected. And Oliver? How is he?" Something softened in Victoria's expression at the mention of her son. "Better, actually. The last round of tests came back clear. We're still monitoring things closely, but the doctors are optimistic. I haven't had much time to process that news properly, with everything else happening." "That's good," Ethan said, meaning it completely. "That's really good, Victoria." They sat together in the quiet of the shop for a long while after that, neither of them rushing to fill the silence, both of them exhausted from a morning that had tested them in ways neither had expected. Eventually, Ethan's phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Peterson, letting him know Lily was asking to come home, confused about why school had been canceled today, a small lie Ethan had asked his neighbor to tell to keep her calm. "I should go get her," Ethan said, standing up. "She's going to have questions." "Do you want me to leave before she comes back?" Victoria asked, hesitant in a way that surprised him. "I don't want to make things harder for you." Ethan considered the question seriously, thinking about his daughter's face every time she talked about Victoria, thinking about the quiet peace that had settled over the shop the day Victoria first walked back through that door. "No," he said finally. "Stay. Lily would want to see you, especially after a day like today, maybe especially because of it." Victoria's eyes softened, something grateful and disbelieving passing across her face, as though she still wasn't entirely used to being wanted somewhere, simply because someone cared, not because of what she could offer. As Ethan walked to get Lily, leaving Victoria alone in the quiet shop, he found himself thinking about how strange the last few weeks had been, how a single phone call in the middle of a storm had unraveled into foreclosure notices, and board meetings, and reporters crowding a street that used to be peaceful and forgettable. He didn't know yet whether Gerald Kane's scheme would succeed or fail, whether the board vote would end Victoria's career or strengthen it, whether the life he had carefully rebuilt after losing his wife could really make room for someone whose world was so different from his own. But he knew one thing clearly as he walked down the quiet street toward Mrs. Peterson's house. Whatever came next, he wasn't facing it alone anymore, and neither, it seemed, was she. The boardroom had never felt so full, every seat occupied, extra chairs brought in along the back wall for shareholders who normally attended by phone but had shown up in person this time, drawn by a story that had spread far beyond the business pages over the past 2 weeks. Victoria stood at the head of the table exactly 1 hour before the scheduled vote, reviewing her notes for the final time, though she barely needed them anymore. She knew exactly what she wanted to say. Gerald Kane sat near the far end of the table, his usual confidence slightly dampened after the past 2 weeks had not gone the way he planned. The story that leaked to the press, the one he had hoped would paint Victoria as distracted and unfit to lead, had instead turned public opinion sharply in her favor. Reporters had dug into Ethan's background, uncovered years of quiet generosity toward his community, small kindnesses that had never made headlines because he never wanted them to. The contrast between his character and the ugly rumors Gerald had spread became impossible to ignore, and slowly, the narrative shifted entirely. Still, the vote remained uncertain. Public sympathy didn't automatically translate into boardroom loyalty, and Victoria understood that better than anyone. "Before we begin," Gerald said, standing as the meeting officially opened, "I'd like to formally withdraw my concerns regarding the board's confidence in current leadership." A ripple of surprise moved through the room, and Victoria felt her pulse quicken, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "After further review," Gerald continued, his jaw tight, clearly forcing the words out, "it's become clear that recent events have demonstrated strong leadership under significant personal pressure, and continued instability at the executive level would serve no one's interests, including my own. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't even close to genuine, and everyone in the room understood that Gerald was simply reading the situation correctly, recognizing that pushing forward with the vote after public opinion had turned so decisively would damage his own standing more than hers. But it was enough. The vote, when it finally happened 20 minutes later, ended in an overwhelming show of confidence, far stronger than Victoria had dared to hope for. She left the boardroom that afternoon lighter than she had felt in months. The weight of uncertainty finally lifted from her shoulders, though she found herself thinking less about the victory itself and more about what she wanted to do with the freedom it gave her. That evening, she drove out to Millhaven instead of going home, pulling up outside Reyes Auto Repair just as Ethan was closing up for the night, Lily sitting on the front step working through a math worksheet while she waited for him to finish. "You survived the vote," Ethan said, wiping his hands on a rag as she approached, a smile spreading across his face that had nothing guarded about it anymore. "I did," Victoria said. Gerald backed down before it even happened. Public opinion apparently is a powerful thing. "Victoria!" Lily called out, abandoning her worksheet immediately and running over. "Did you win? Dad said you had a really big meeting today." "I did win," Victoria said, crouching down slightly to Lily's level. "Thanks to your dad, actually. If people hadn't found out what kind of person he really is, things might have gone very differently." Lily beamed with pride, glancing over at her father. "I told you people would figure out you're the nicest man in Millhaven eventually." Ethan laughed, shaking his head, and gestured for both of them to follow him inside as he finished locking up. "I was thinking about ordering pizza tonight, if either of you are interested. Nothing fancy, just something easy after the week we've all had." "I would love that," Victoria said, and she meant it more than she had meant almost anything in years. Over the following weeks, something steady began to grow between them, built not on grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but on small, ordinary moments that mattered more than either of them expected. Victoria began stepping back from parts of her role that had consumed every waking hour of her life, delegating more, trusting her team the way she used to, before fear made her grip too tight on everything. She spent more evenings in Millhaven than in the city, more mornings watching Oliver and Lily argue cheerfully over board games than sitting through meetings that used to feel urgent, and now felt increasingly small in comparison to what she had found here. Oliver, once he was healthy enough to travel comfortably, met Ethan and Lily on a quiet Saturday afternoon, and within an hour, the two children were laughing together over something in the garage that Ethan was patiently trying to explain, an easy friendship forming without any of the complications the adults had worried about. "He's really good with kids," Victoria said, watching from a distance as Ethan showed both children how a simple engine worked, answering their endless questions with more patience than she had ever seen from anyone in her professional life. "He always has been," Ethan's neighbor mentioned once, when Victoria asked about him during a quiet conversation outside the shop. "Even before his wife passed, that man never learned how to say no to somebody who needed help, nearly ran himself into the ground trying to help everyone else before he ever thought about himself." Victoria understood that better now than she had weeks earlier, standing in a storm on Highway 9. She understood it wasn't recklessness or naivety that drove Ethan to help strangers without expecting anything back. It was simply who he was, steady and unwavering, the kind of person the world didn't create nearly often enough. 3 months after the vote, Ethan stood in his shop late one evening, long after Lily had gone to sleep upstairs, reorganizing tools out of habit more than necessity, his mind elsewhere entirely. Victoria had become such a constant presence in their lives that the quiet moments without her now felt strange, the shop somehow less full than it used to feel, even before he knew she existed. His phone buzzed with a message from her, a simple photo of Oliver and Lily building an elaborate tower out of spare parts in Victoria's backyard, both children grinning wildly at the camera, chaos and joy captured perfectly in a single frame. Ethan smiled at the photo for a long moment before typing back a response, something easy and warm, and found himself thinking about how strange this entire journey had been, starting with a phone call in the middle of a storm that could have gone unanswered just as easily as it had been answered. He thought about his father, about the shop that had nearly slipped away from him just months earlier, about the quiet years of struggle that had felt endless at the time and now seemed like they belonged to an entirely different life. He thought about his late wife and the ache that never fully disappeared but had softened over time into something gentler, something that made room for new happiness rather than blocking it out entirely. And he thought about Victoria, about the fear in her voice the first night he met her, about the woman who had built walls around herself out of necessity and slowly, carefully, learned to let them down again, not because someone convinced her to, but because she chose to, piece by piece, moment by moment. A week later, on a warm evening with the kind of golden light that made even ordinary streets look beautiful, Victoria arrived at the shop earlier than usual, Oliver in tow, both of them carrying bags from the bakery down the street that had become a regular stop whenever they visited. "I have news," Victoria said, setting the bags down on the counter, unable to hide the excitement in her voice. "I've decided to restructure my role at the company. I'm stepping back from daily operations, promoting my leadership team to handle most of what I used to insist on doing myself." "That's a big change," Ethan said, watching her carefully. "It is," Victoria agreed. "But it's the right one. I spent so many years believing I had to control everything myself, that stepping back meant failing somehow. I don't believe that anymore. I want more time for the things that actually matter." Lily, who had been listening from her spot near the counter, looked up with sudden interest. "Does that mean you'll be around more? Like, a lot more?" Victoria glanced at Ethan first, something unspoken passing between them, before turning back to Lily with a warm smile. "If that's all right with everyone, yes, a lot more." Lily's face lit up completely, and even Oliver, usually more reserved than his energetic new friend, grinned at the announcement. Ethan stepped closer to Victoria as the children returned to their conversation about weekend plans, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Are you sure about this? Walking away from the world you built?" "I'm not walking away from it," Victoria said, meeting his eyes steadily. "I'm just finally choosing what actually matters within it. You taught me that, whether you realize it or not. The night you drove out into that storm for a stranger, you showed me what it looks like to give without keeping score. I spent my whole life keeping score, Ethan, measuring everything by what it could get me in return. I don't want to live like that anymore." Ethan reached for her hand, something steady and certain settling over him as their fingers intertwined. "For what it's worth, I think you already changed, somewhere between the highway and now, without even realizing it." Outside, the evening settled gently over Millhaven, the small town that had once seemed too ordinary to hold anything remarkable, now quietly witnessing the beginning of something neither Ethan nor Victoria had expected when a phone rang in the middle of a storm months earlier. Two children laughed over something on the sidewalk, unaware of how close their families had come to never meeting at all, unaware of boardrooms and foreclosure notices and reporters crowding a quiet street, aware only of the simple, ordinary joy of the present moment. Ethan closed the shop for the night, the same way he had 1,000 times before, except this time he wasn't walking upstairs to an empty kitchen table lit only by the glow of an unopened envelope. This time, laughter followed him through the door, warm and full and entirely unplanned, proof that sometimes the most ordinary nights carry the seeds of an entirely different life, waiting quietly for someone brave enough to answer the phone.